Luke's record of the gospel account, and you can kind of appreciate the fact that Jesus wants his disciples to understand this example that he's provided for them, and that this rising up at supper and washing the feet of his disciples was intended to teach them something. It was intended to help them learn and appreciate the fact that Jesus was the epitome of an example for anything and everything that they needed to appreciate. Not just the idea of service that he's rendering in that moment, but I want you to go back in that narrative that Ron just read for us and notice verse 17 again with me as he said, "If you know these things, happy or blessed are ye if you do them." Not just the idea of service of washing of feet, but I believe Jesus has a greater principle in mind here when he talks about this idea of blessed or happy are you if you do them. Do what? Follow the Lord. Follow the Master. You say that I am Lord and Master, and you say, well, for so I am. He says that in that context. And if you appreciate the fact that I am legitimately your Lord and Master, then I should be the example that you're following. My point that I want us to appreciate this morning is that happiness and being blessed comes God's way. It comes by following the example and the purposes that Jesus has enumerated for us and lived before us within the Scriptures. We're commonly familiar with this phrase, right? Here in the United States, we have in our rights this idea of the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we have those rights given to us by our nation's laws and the prescription that we have in terms of a nation. But I want us to appreciate that though we might have those freedoms as citizens of a nation, Jesus didn't give us permission to pursue happiness any old way you choose. He said genuine happiness, real happiness, genuine blessings come when you pursue those things that the Master has given to us. And this morning, I just want to share 3 examples with you of those who thought they knew a path that would bring the joy and happiness that they were seeking. They thought for sure that those choices and decisions that they were making would bring exactly what it is that they wanted, but in the end result, it didn't bring any of the happiness they thought it might. And I'm going to find all of those examples this morning in your Old Testament. But before we get into those, let me share a couple of things with you. And first, let me share with you that just have permission to make choices does not represent God's approval of those choices. Just because God doesn't immediately strike you dead because you stepped outside His will and purposes, just because some immediate consequence doesn't occur, doesn't mean that God has somehow given permission to anything and everything. And we talked a little bit about that last Sunday morning. As we study through this morning, I want us to also appreciate that choices have consequence. We try to live in a consequence-free society. And what I mean by that is we try to imply this idea that you can do anything, act any way, behave in any way you want, and it's all okay because I have my personal rights. As we were flying to Florida this past week, and we were on the plane to flying down, and there was a lady on the plane that refused to put away her vape. And she was using her electronic cigarette here on this plane that we're flying, and they warned her, and then they told her again, then they handed her a pamphlet, and guess what? When we were deboarding, she was not. She was still sitting there waiting for the law. You don't just get to do anything you want and then have no consequences. And I thought that was a perfect illustration of that. That, she felt like that she had a right to sit there and do what she wanted. Though the laws and restrictions told her no, she thought that it was still her personal right to do so, and now she's paying the consequences of that decision. We have to appreciate in life, friends, that there are consequences. That our choices have meaning, and they lead us to places, and they bring sometimes reward and benefit, and sometimes they bring consequence. And what we need to appreciate this morning is that if we choose God's path towards happiness, it will bring that. But going against the will and purposes of God brings challenges. Some choices may seem to benefit my immediate earthly circumstance, but they ultimately create challenge to my soul. And again, now let me share with you those three examples. First, I want you to go back into the book of Genesis in chapter 13 and appreciate the example of Lot. Now, sometimes we focus on Sodom and Gomorrah in relationship to this piece of history, but I want to focus on Lot and his choices here. There were certainly consequential choices to the behaviors of those in Sodom and Gomorrah, and when that fire and brimstone comes raining down, they recognize the consequences of alienating themselves from the God of heaven. But what I want us to appreciate is what Lot did to himself and to his family by the choices and decisions that he made, thinking maybe he wouldn't find the consequences. Genesis chapter 13, verse 5. He says, Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. Now you think about the wealth and benefits that Abraham and Lot had collectively, that they had so much stuff that the land that they were residing in that particular moment couldn't contain it all. The herds and the flocks and the servants and the people that were associated with that entourage, that where they were located, couldn't handle all of that, and so they needed to make some decisions as it relates to that. As you continue to read the narrative, and there was a strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock, and the Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. So you've got Lot's folks that are taking care of his herds and Abram's herdsmen. They're arguing over who has rights to what pieces of the land. And then you've got the natives, right? You've got those who were residing there and dwelt there. There's issues with them. We've got to find an answer. So Abram says, verse 8, to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. Pause. I believe Abram's a righteous man. I believe he exemplifies that, though he's not perfect. And we could point out moments in his life where he makes mistakes and missteps and sins and transgressions. We can recognize those moments. But Abram is a righteous man. And he's been chosen by God to become the initial process that would ultimately lead to Jesus. He, as a righteous man, recognized that there were places he could go to the right or the left that would not alienate him from God. Now, I'm trying to illustrate to you that point, and I'll understand it even better here in a moment when it comes to Lot's decision. Abraham says, or Abram at this point, you go to the right, I'll go to the left. You go left, I'll go right. There's plenty of land here that we can go and establish ourselves. So Lot lifted his eyes and saw the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as go toward Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. So Lot chooses east, Abraham's going to choose west. They're going to separate and find enough land to take care of all of them in the process. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. What I want us to appreciate about that phrase that I think is historically important is Lot didn't have to pitch his tent as far as Sodom. Lot could have stayed away from that area. Lot had plenty of room there in the plains of Jordan that he could have resided without associating and connecting himself to the challenges of the city of Sodom. He chose that. Abram could have gone to the east like Lot did. If Lot had chosen to go towards Canaan, then that would have put Abram choosing the other direction, and he could have chosen that and resided in the plains without difficulty. It was Lot's choice to pitch his tent as far as Sodom that created the challenges. Because the men, verse 13, of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot has said, to lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are northward, southward, eastward, and westward. You've got room now. Lot wanted the best fields. He saw the watered areas, plains and areas for his herds and his flocks, and things would be able to be beneficial for him in that location. But he chose to go as far as Sodom. And in a sense, I think the text is trying to imply he becomes a citizen of that place. He connects himself to the place where the citizens of that place have become so exceedingly sinful and wicked in the eyes of God. He chose that. He didn't have to choose it, but he did. And you know some of the rest of the narrative that we won't spend time dealing with, but God had sent a couple of angels towards Abraham, told he and Sarah they were going to have a child. Then those beings go on over and are going to deal with this situation where God says he had seen or heard in that symbolic kind of language of what had been going on at Sodom and Gomorrah, and I'm going to go visit that place and see it for myself. And he sends those two beings, those angels, to go down into there, and they find it just as God had feared. And God decides that he's going to destroy that place. But he's going to give Lot an opportunity. Abram had begged God, remember, if I can find 50, if I can find 40, if I can find 30, if I can find 10. God says, yes, yes, yeah. If you can find that many righteous souls there. And ultimately, it's just through the mercy of God that Lot is able to have an opportunity to escape the consequence that God is going to pour out. But notice what happens. Verse 14 of chapter 19 of the book of Genesis. He says, so Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law. This is after he was told the destruction's coming. And he goes to his sons-in-law, who had married his daughters, and said, get up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But his sons-in-law, he seemed to be joking or mocking or just of no serious import here. You see, there were two daughters at home, and we know that awful scene that transpires as it relates to that. There were a couple of daughters that were still in the house, but others had married sons of that place, and they were out of the house and living in their own homes with their sons, with Lot's sons-in-laws. He goes and begs them to leave with him, and the sons-in-laws look at him as if he's just making all this up, and they choose not to go. Lot's decision to go and pitch his tent towards Sodom had greater consequence than just for himself. That's the point I'm driving at. His choice affected other people's choices. Now, is he 100% accountable for their decision making? No. Are we going to be held accountable for the choices and decisions that other people make in relationship to our eternal salvation? Not specifically. But I will be held accountable how I led people and what kind of example I gave to others and whether I encouraged them towards righteousness or I led them in a different direction. And those things can be forgiven of, by the way, as well. But I just want us to appreciate that he thought he was pursuing happiness, and it didn't bring any of those things. He thought he was pursuing the best place where my herds can just grow and the flocks can grow and everything's going to be wonderful. And it turns out to be nothing like what he had expected. His family, his extended family, ignores him. Verse 16, and while he lingered, he's still not ready to leave. He had become so attached to that place, though it had become so exceedingly sinful. And you remember the scene as those folks are trying to beat down the doors, and they have to strike them blind in order to try to keep Lot and his family safe. But Lot still feels so connected to that place that he's dragging his feet when they told him to get out. Friends, when we see the warning signs of the destruction that we're bringing to ourselves, when we see the warning signs that we're being led further and further away from God, as soon as you see the signs, don't linger anymore. Get out of that. Don't wait. When the warning signs are there, don't wait. All because we think we're pursuing happiness. While he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his two daughters, the ones that were still at home, and the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. They physically have to grab him and his family and drag them out of there. We talked last week about how sin can take hold of us in ways that we don't always expect or understand. He thought he was pursuing happiness, and now he's lost some of his family because they refused to leave. Now he's challenged with his daughters. His wife then ultimately in verse 26, though they were told that you get out and don't look back. You think, well, what kind of arbitrary kind of rule is that? Don't look back. But it's not arbitrary. You think about it. What's God's point? God's point is you're leaving and you're not going to have any thought about wanting to be back in that place. You've got to move forward and not think about what you're leaving behind. But she chose to look back, and we know the account says she became a pillar of salt there in verse 26. What's your point, Brian? My point is he thought he was pursuing happiness. And instead, he finds himself in the consequences of God's destructive path when it came to the sins of a wicked place like Sodom and Gomorrah. And it affected his family. It affected some of his family that refused to leave. It affected his wife when she chooses to look back. His decision to pitch his tent towards Sodom, though he thought that might have been the greatest decision he could ever make, didn't work out that way. Be careful how we pursue happiness. Jump over a couple chapters to chapter 27. Jacob thought that he just had to have that birthright. I've just got to be the top in this family chain. I've got to be the one who receives all the authority and the great blessings that are going to come. I've got to be that one. And he was willing to get it and receive it in any way that he could find. Verse 18 of chapter 27 of the book of Genesis. So he went to his father and said, "My father," and he said, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" And Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau. I'm the older brother." Now remember, Isaac is losing his sight by this point in his life. He's unable to discern who it is that's in front of him. And he says, "I have done just as you told me. Please arise, sit and eat my game, that your soul may bless me." It's interesting. Isaac has some, you keep reading. We won't spend time looking at the whole narrative, but Isaac's got some suspicions here, right? How did you fix that meal so fast? Well, Mom helped, right? How did you receive all this? And then you know that moment where, so they'd prepared a way that if he touched his arms, Esau was all hairy, and so they would know. All of this deception in order to receive what he thought would bring him happiness. Verse 35 of our text, notice that he said, when Isaac realizes that when Esau comes and he's weeping over the fact that the birthright has been given away, what is going on here? And he said, "Your brother came with deceit and has taken away your blessing." Friends, if you have to lie, cheat, steal, or deceive others to receive it because you think it'll make you happy, it ain't worth it. It's not worth it. It's not worth having to deceive people in order to receive it. It's not worth trying to lie about it and cheat in order to receive it. It's not worth it. That's the point. Jacob makes a decision that that birthright was the end all of all things that would bring him happiness and joy and blessing in life. And he was determined that no matter what it took, he would do it in order to receive it. And now he sets a course and a path that will bring challenge and difficulty day after day from this point forward. Because the man who used deception in order to receive the birthright then has to flee the brother who's not happy about it. And then later, when he finds himself looking for a wife, and guess what happens? Well, you remember the story, don't you? He falls in love with Rachel, convinces Laban to allow him to have her as his wife, but Laban didn't really want to give the younger before the older, and so he deceives Jacob and gives him Leah instead. And so it came to pass in the morning that, behold, it was Leah, he said. And he said to Laban in verse 25 of Genesis 29, what is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why have you deceived me? Interesting, right? It doesn't feel so good now that Jacob's on the other side of that equation. When it was him deceiving his father in order to receive the birthright, it was all fine because that was what he was pursuing in terms of his joy and happiness that he wanted to receive. But now that he's receiving it in return, it doesn't feel so good. But friends, once you kind of set certain things in motion and you refuse to just acknowledge and admit those things and ask forgiveness and make changes, you can just set a course of deception and challenges and lies that just keep perpetuating themselves. All because he thought it would make him happy. Then his sons come on the scene. Jump to chapter 37. In chapter 37 and in verse 29. Do we kill Joseph? Do we not? Dad likes him more than he likes us. Should we just get rid of him? Should we sell him? What, right? You can this odd kind of debate going on among the other brothers. They decide to put him in a pit for a while. Then Reuben returns to the pit, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit. And he tore his clothes, and he returned to his brothers and said, the lad is no more, and where shall I go? So they took Joseph's tunic, and killed a kid of the goats, and dipped it in the tunic in the blood. And then they sent the tunic of many collars, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not? So these are Jacob's children, by the way. This path that he set in motion from that day that he chose to deceive and lie about the birthright hasn't stopped. His father-in-law uses the same kind of thing. Now his sons are using the same kind of treachery. And, is this his tunic? And he recognized it. It is my son's tunic. And a wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. Can you imagine that their decision-making was so important to them and what they thought they needed to do, what they were willing to let their father believe that his son had been ripped to shreds by a wild animal? That they were willing to live with that? And Jacob tore his clothes in verse 34 and put on sackcloth on his waist and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, for I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. Thus his father wept for him. The Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar as an officer of Pharaoh and a captain of the guard. And sometimes I don't think we realize what kind of consequential chain that we could start. One decision that we thought was just a matter of something I wanted, and so a little deception, a little lie, a little moment that isn't quite right, but it's a pursuit that I think is going to be beneficial to me, and you set a course of motion in play that for them hasn't stopped. I want you to notice his assessment now. Jacob's assessment of all this at the end of the process. In Genesis 47 and verse 9, Jacob says to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. What he thought was going to bring happiness and joy and benefit and a birthright and a great benefit that it would extend to him, all of those blessings that he thought he would receive. And at the end of 130 years, he just looked back and said it was all evil. All I did was set a course of evil in motion that went from me to my father-in-law to my sons. Be careful how we pursue happiness. Because if it is outside the will and purposes of God, if it uses means that God would not approve of, if I have to lie and steal and cheat in order to receive it, number one, it's not personally beneficial to do that. And number two, it may set a course of action that just continues to create greater problems moving forward. And let me share one last example with you. I think about Israel as a whole. And I think about the things that they desired. And God had given judges to rule over them when they repossessed the land of Canaan and they began to reside there. He established a system of judges that would give them some legal standing, and they had disputes or challenges or needed knowledge or information to be imparted to them from God. But a situation arose, and I have verse 6 on the screen, but I want you to start with me in verse 1 of chapter 8 of 1 Samuel. He says, "Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, 'Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations.' But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' So Samuel prayed to the Lord." Friends, I want us to hear why I wanted to use this example for you this morning is this. Their situation is understandable, right? They're frustrated. Samuel, you've put Joel and Abijah in charge as being judge over Beersheba, but they're not like you. They're not fair like you. They don't have the mind of God like you. They don't think and behave like you. They're taking bribes in order to give rulings that are better in favor of somebody that comes and has more money than the next guy. They are not good judges. Is all of that true? Yes. And sometimes when we convince ourselves that this situation isn't what it ought to be, I can choose any path that I want to correct that situation. Because that one's bad. And anything that I would choose is okay because that one's bad and I'm just trying to overrule that one. And so they come to Samuel and they didn't ask him. Did you notice? They didn't come to Samuel and say, "Hey, those sons of yours that you put in charge there in Beersheba, they're not very good judges. You know it. I know it. Everybody here knows it. Put some new judges in place." Right? That's the answer. God's plan and purposes, His design to rule over the people were to use these judges. Put some new judges in place. These guys are not good. We're sorry about that, Samuel. We know they're your sons, but they're not good. We need new judges. That would have been fair. But that's not really what they wanted. What they wanted was to use a situation that they could label as bad, so then they could say, no, we want to do this instead now. We want to advocate over top of what God desired. We want to go beyond what He had offered to us through this system of judges, and we want a king like all the other nations have. Friends, never use a wrong situation to create another wrong situation. Never look at a situation and say, well, this is so bad that this has got to be better, even though it's not right either. We don't answer evil with evil. You don't respond to sin with sin. You don't transgress in order to avoid a transgression. We get so mixed up sometimes in our pursuit of joy and happiness and what's going to make things so much better. And they said, give us a king, not give us new judges. It's interesting because Samuel's upset and he prays before the Lord. And verse 7 says, the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. It's an interesting point, by the way, I think sometimes we need to remind ourselves of. Sometimes we can become discouraged when we're trying to share the message of the gospel and help folks appreciate salvation that can come through the message of the Scriptures. And we feel like we failed if they don't respond favorably. We feel like we didn't do enough because they didn't respond in the way that we were hoping for. But friends, when somebody rejects the gospel message of Jesus Christ, when somebody rejects the message of the Scriptures, they are not rejecting you. It didn't come from you. And it didn't come from me. They're not rejecting us, they're rejecting God. Samuel says they didn't reject Or God says to Samuel, they didn't reject you, Samuel. When they're asking for a king, they're asking to do something different than I offered them. They're rejecting me. That I should not reign over them. That I could they could put a man in charge over them rather than the King of heaven. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Samuel, it's been this way since the day I brought them out of Egypt. Everything I've done for them and blessed them with and gave them in order to bring happiness and benefit to them, they're always complaining. And they always wanted something different. And they were always pursuing something other than what God desired for them. Friends, it meant rejecting God, not Samuel. Oh, this is going to be great. We're going to be like other nations. And we're going to have a king. It said these series of judges, and they're not very good anyway. And all these things are going to be so wonderful for us. But they're told, you better be careful. He says, as soon as you've got a king, the behavior of the king will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots. You better think about this, he says. You think it's going to make things all great and it's going to be really going to bring joy and happiness because you've got a king like all the other nations. Until you're trying to plow your fields and the king's got your sons driving his chariots instead. When you're ready to build a heritage for your family. And now your sons are working for the king instead. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over his 50s. Will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields. Even if you had your sons to be able to plant it, he might just take the field because he's the king. And your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage and give it to his officers and servants. He's going to tax you. The day you put him in position, he's going to tax you. And he will take your male servants, your female servants, your finest young men, and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your sheep, and you will be his servants. And you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. Go ahead and pursue this, God says. I'm warning you, it's not going to bring the happiness you think it is. I'm challenging you to appreciate this is not going to be the great joy and blessing fest that you think it's going to be. Go ahead. But when all of these things that I'm warning you about come, don't weep towards me, God says. Because I've told you what's going to happen. Friends, there are a lot of times in Scripture God tells us what's going to happen. There are a lot of times in our lives, and I suppose there are moments where maybe ignorance kicks in and we just didn't know and we do something, and because we didn't know, we have to face the consequences of that choice. But there are a lot of times we do know. There are a lot of times we know exactly what God has told us. We know exactly what His will is. We know exactly what He's taught us. We know exactly what it is that He wants, and I choose something different anyway. And then I sit back and hope the consequence doesn't come and that the challenges don't arrive. They wanted a king. They were told what would happen if they got a king. They chose that king anyway. And Hosea teaches us that they live to regret it. Go back into that prophet for a moment. The book of Hosea. Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea. I know we don't go there very often. Hosea chapter 13. Unless you're using an iPad, then you've got an advantage on us. Hosea chapter 13, verse 9. O Israel, you are destroyed, but your help is from me. God speaking. I will be your king. Where is any other that he may save you in all your cities? And your judges to whom you said, give me a king and princes? I gave you a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath. I gave you a king because I was angry that you refused me as your king. If you'll let me be your king, Now that you understand the consequences, now that you regret all that decision making, now that you have faced all the demise and challenges that those kings have brought to you. Very few periods of time in which the history of those people had benefit because of those kings. Generally, it was trouble. When they divided, Israel didn't have anyone that served God, that served them as a king. Judah had a handful. It didn't tend to last very long. Hosea tells them, listen, through the voice of God, because you rejected God as king, and in His anger, He gave you a king, and it created all kinds of difficulties and challenges, but God says, I'm the answer. Friends, my point is this. You can pursue happiness, and as a citizen of the United States, you have a right to the life, liberty, and the pursuit of that happiness. And you can choose it by law any way you want within certain restrictions. But God doesn't say if you pursue happiness any way you want that there won't be consequences and challenges and difficulties that come along the way. And we've looked at 3 examples of how that's happened this morning. Sometimes we convince ourselves that our happiness is more important than what God has stated. Sometimes we convince ourselves that my personal earthly existence and circumstance deserves whatever happiness that I want, and however it is I need to achieve that is fine. But I hope this morning that we've illustrated through these 3 examples that that's not true. And that many a times in our lives we have pursued something and we've chosen something and we've reaped the consequences and challenges because of that decision making. I guarantee you, young folks that are in the room, if you go ask somebody over the age of 50, whether they could illustrate a few moments in their lives where they chose a pursuit over something and thought that was the right thing and then reaped the consequences for it, I guarantee you they can all share a moment or two with you of when that happened. Let's be wise in our pursuit of happiness. Let's seek it as servants of Jesus and follow the example of the one who rose up and washed the feet of His disciples. We have the purposes of God before us within Scripture, and He'll bring a joy that no one else can bring. And He'll provide a happiness that no one else could provide. Pursue happiness, but pursue it God's way, and find ultimately out of that an eternal joy that will benefit us while we long for it, and that will benefit us when we receive it. And if we can encourage you to step into the promises of God this morning, we'd invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.